Can you break down the notion of Jesus being God by predication or by identity? Why do we make this distinction? So monarchical Trinitarianism, if you start with this lecture here, Dr. Branson is going to explain that in the early church, and particularly in the Creed and in the Cappadocians, and that's what matters the most, because for the Trinity, Constantinople I is pretty much the church's dogmatizing of the doctrine of the Trinity. And that's all Cappadocian theology. In fact, the council actually stated, or the emperor at the council said, everyone has to agree with Nissa's formulation or you're not Orthodox. That's Constantinople I's mindset. And so that mindset is what's called monarchical Trinitarianism. Just like the Creed, it says we believe in one God, the Father. When we use that term, the one God, we are primarily picking out the person of the Father. It is not primarily referring to the common divine essence. And this is a pretty big distinction between the Orthodox conception of the Trinity and the Thomistic conception of the Trinity. I would typically say Roman Catholicism in general, at least pretty much dogmatically, if you look at the Fourth Lateran Council, because it uses the Lombard definition of simplicity, which is essentially kind of an essentialist reductionist position, identity thesis it's called, versus the Uniates, right? So the Uniates, which are very much a minority, would probably agree with the Orthodox on this. So you can't technically say that every single Roman Catholic has this essentialist Thomistic model, but at least dogmatically, officially, for the most part, 99% of Roman Catholicism is not monarchical Trinitarianism. So they get hung up on things like, does Jesus derive his divinity, and does he depend on the Father for his hypostasis and for his divinity, for his essence? And the answer is yes. In fact, it's not just Nicaea that teaches, it's not just Constantinople, it's Nicaea 1 that teaches that the Son depends on the Father for his existence and for his essence and for his hypostasis. The whole of the Son, the totality of the Son, is dependent on the Father. And it's a Muslim argument to think that because there's dependence, that therefore they are not all God. This is called the Eunomian premise. And if you watch the debate between Jake and Dr. Branson shows through a logic table that Jake is using a fallacy. And Jake eventually just melts down and loses it, right? He totally flounders, loses the debate, because you can't demonstrate that to be amongst the class of things called God or uncreated, you must possess aseity, or that you cannot come from another. It's just like, every time we do this analogy, I'm hoping people can understand it. You can be a carnivore and you can be an omnivore, right? They are both amongst the class of things that eat meat. But one of them has additional properties of not just eating meat, but also eating vegetables. But if you are a omnivore, you are also a carnivore. So omnivore and carnivore are under the class of things that, quote, eat meat. Even though the omnivore, has more things that it eats. It has more properties and traits than the carnivore. It doesn't mean that because the carnivore lacks what the omnivore has, it's therefore not amongst the class of meat eaters. It's a very simple, once again, grammar argument. And when you listen to Dr. Branson's lectures, he will actually go into grammar. A lot of these issues are mistakes that are made in grammar. So likewise, when it comes to Muslims and the Trinity, they try to argue that the word God can only have one referent. It can only refer to the divine essence. But the word God refers to, at least in the Cappadocian theology, almost entirely the Father. Does that mean the Son isn't divine, or isn't, quote, God, or isn't fully whatever in terms of nature? No. Because he derives his existence, his person, his entire hypostasis from the Father, it does not follow that he's ontologically subordinate. And to prove that, you have to prove this point about the logic table, that the Eunomian premise that Jake tries to prove to Dr. Branson, that somehow to be God necessarily in the definition of God is aseity. And that's not true. Because the Son does not possess aseity. He is from another. I think it's Oration 23 of St. Gregory Nazianzus, where he says this exact same thing. So they're getting hung up on words, and they think that because primarily we use the term God to refer to the hypostasis of the Father, that somehow that makes the Son ontologically subordinate. When the irony is that it's actually Roman Catholics that subordinate the Holy Spirit through the doctrine of the Filioque, because they give a power to the Father and the Son that the Spirit lacks. So ironically, theirs is the position that is subordination. So hopefully that helps once again to clear up this point that always comes up between Muslims and Roman Catholics on... I think between the Muslim and the Roman Catholic, there's a similar mistake that's being made, that they think that a word necessarily contains the ontological baggage that one context of that word has. So if God is ever used to refer to the entire triad, then God must always and forever be a reference to the common divine essence. And it's just simply not. In fact, in the Creed, we believe in one God, the Father. In other words, one God is picking out or referring to the person of the Father in the Creed, not the essence. Even though the Son has the same essence as the Father, he does not have the same role as the Father. The Father in Cappadocian theology is the fount, the source, the cause, the arche, the one arche, the anarche. Those are all terms that Basil uses to pick out the hypostasis of the Father. He is the unoriginate one. Gregory Nazianzus calls the Son the originate one. And by extension, the Spirit is also originate. Both have their origin in the person of the Father's essence. Not in the common essence, the Father's essence. The Son springs forth from the Father's essence. That's very important in Trinitarian theology. We do not begin to attribute generation and procession to the common essence, even though Aquinas does that, even though many Roman Catholics do that. That's actually false. Nicaea 1 is very clear that the Father generates a Son according to his essence. And that means, as Jesus says, everything that he has from the Father. And by extension, obviously, the Spirit too. Everything the Spirit has, he has from the Father through the Son. And that does not make the Son a cause or a source of the Spirit's hypostasis or essence, merely because he proceeds through him. In fact, that's what the Tomos against John Beckos is about. So hopefully that helps clear things up.